The wind in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana doesn't just blow, it hunts. It moves through the canyons like a living thing, seeking out cracks in the timber, gaps in the wool, and weakness in the soul. In the winter of 1935, when the Great Depression had already chewed the meat off the bones of the American West, the wind screaming through the Blackfoot Valley sounded like a warning that nobody was left alive to hear. It was a landscape of blinding white and bruising purple shadows, a place where the temperature could drop 40 degrees in an hour, freezing cattle where they stood in the fields, their breath caught in their throats as ice. Hidden deep within this frozen cathedral, 30 miles from the nearest paved road and a world away from the law, sat the fortress of the Iron Flock. They called it a sanctuary. The locals in the town of Darby, shivering in their uninsulated shacks, called it a powder keg, waiting for a match. To the desperate masses riding the rails, Jedediah Blackwood was a savior, a charismatic preacher who had gathered lost souls during the hardest economic collapse in history, promising them food, warmth, and salvation from a government that had failed them. But inside the high timber walls of the compound, reinforced with barbed wire and patrolled by men with rifles, salvation had a steep price. Jedediah wasn't just a preacher. He was a king in a kingdom of snow, a man whose paranoia was as vast and unforgiving as the wilderness surrounding him. This is not a story about faith. It is a story about the terrifying chemistry of love and ignorance. It is about a 19-year-old girl named Maddie Vance who walked down an aisle made of rough-hewn pine, wearing a dress that had been sewn by a dozen trembling hands, carrying inside her body a secret that would kill her before the honeymoon was over. She didn't know she was dying. She didn't know that the glass of blessed tonic her mother had pressed into her hands just hours before wasn't a miracle cure. It was a heavy metal cocktail of mercury and hope, a folk remedy that would turn the most important night of her life into a crime scene that would haunt Montana for a century. To understand why Maddie Vance died and why 20 people would eventually bleed out in the snow to pay for it, you have to understand the air inside the Iron Flock. It was 1935. The outside world was starving. Men were standing in bread lines in Chicago. Dust storms were bearing Oklahoma. But in Blackwood's compound, the granaries were full. The fires were hot. The smell of roasting elk meat filled the air. Jedediah preached that the Depression was God's flail, threshing the wheat from the chaff. Only those within his walls were chosen. Only those who obeyed his absolute law would survive the coming winter of the soul. But the king had a problem. His lineage was failing. Jedediah was 50 years old, a man of towering height and terrifying intensity, with a beard streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to see through the skin to the sin beneath. He had buried 2 wives in the frozen earth behind the chapel. The first died of exhaustion after birthing a stillborn. The second, a fiery woman named Sarah, had died only a year prior, whispering about demons in the water and clawing at her own skin. With no sons to inherit his kingdom, Jedediah's paranoia began to curdle into madness. He believed there was a curse on his house. He believed that the devil was trying to snuff out his bloodline to prevent the coming of the new prophet. And so, in October of that year, as the first snows began to dust the peaks, he issued a decree that chilled the community more than the approaching blizzard. He announced the gathering. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Every unmarried woman in the compound and every eligible daughter from the satellite settlements scattered throughout the valley was to present herself for inspection. He was not looking for a partner. He was not looking for love. He was looking for a pure vessel. He was looking for a breeder who could withstand the curse and bear him a son of iron. Maddie Vance was 19. She had the kind of beauty that belongs to the mountains, pale skin that burned easily in the high-altitude sun, dark eyes that held the quiet resilience of a deer in winter, and hair the color of wheat ready for harvest. She was the daughter of Eudora Vance, a woman who had joined the flock 5 years earlier after her husband died in a mining accident in Butte. Eudora was a true believer. She scrubbed the chapel floors on her knees until her skin was raw. She gave her food rations to the guards to buy favor. She believed, with a desperation born of widowhood and poverty, that Jedediah Blackwood was the only thing standing between her daughter and the hell of the outside world. When the decree was read in the mess hall, Eudora gripped Maddie's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. For Eudora, this wasn't a predatory demand from a lecherous leader. It was the ultimate lottery ticket. If Maddie was chosen, she wouldn't be just another mouth to feed, another worker in the laundry. She would be the queen of the mountain. She would be safe. She would be warm. She would never have to worry about the winter again. But Maddie was sick. It wasn't a sickness you could see at first. It was a weakness, a lethargy that made her bones ache and her skin clammy. In the weeks leading up to the gathering, Maddie had been fainting during her chores. She was pale, her breath short, her hands shaking when she tried to thread a needle. In any other place, she might have seen a doctor, but in the iron flock, sickness was suspicious. Illness was often interpreted as a spiritual failing, a sign that your faith was weak, or worse, that you were harboring secret sins. If Jedediah found out she was frail, she wouldn't be chosen. She might be cast out into the snow to fend for herself. Eudora Vance loved her daughter with a ferocity that bordered on violence. She saw Maddie fading, and she made a choice. She didn't go to Dr. Halloway, the compound's physician, a man who reported every cough directly to Jedediah. She went to her trunk. She dug past the Bible, past the wool blankets, to a small velvet-lined box she had brought with her from the old world, from the mining camps where folk medicine was the only medicine. Inside the box was a blue glass bottle. It had no label. It contained a thick, silvery liquid suspended in an herbal syrup. In the mining camps of Butte, the old women called it Quicksilver Tonic. They whispered that it could cure anything: syphilis, consumption, bad blood. They said it heated the womb, making it ready for life. They said it gave a woman the strength of iron. They didn't know it was pure mercury chloride. Eudora didn't know she was holding poison. She thought she was holding liquid survival. Every morning, for 2 weeks leading up to the inspection, she mixed a spoonful of the heavy liquid into Maddie's morning tea. "Drink," Eudora would whisper, smoothing Maddie's hair, watching the girl swallow the bitter draught. "It will make you strong. It will make you shine for him." And in a cruel twist of biology, for a few days, it seemed to work. The mercury acted as a stimulant. Maddie's cheeks flushed a bright, artificial pink. Her eyes widened, the pupils dilated, giving her a look of intense, almost angelic focus. The tremors in her hands were dismissed as excitement. The sweat on her brow was seen as fervor. The day of the gathering was a spectacle of grim efficiency. The compound's great hall was cleared of tables. The windows were draped in black cloth to block out the sun. 50 young women stood in rows, dressed in identical white shifts, shivering in the drafty room. They were not allowed to speak. They were inventory. Jedediah walked the lines. He moved slowly, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. He was flanked by his deacons, men with rifles and dead eyes who enforced his will. He didn't look at the girls' faces. He looked at their hips. He looked at their hands. He grabbed their chins and inspected their teeth like he was buying horses at an auction. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of a girl who had collapsed from fear in the back row. Jedediah ignored her. Weakness was a sin. He stopped in front of Maddie. The mercury was coursing through her system now. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, a symptom of the toxicity, but to Jedediah, it looked like the spirit moving within her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on his. She looked radiant, burning with an inner fire that he mistook for purity. "What is your name, child?" Jedediah asked, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in her chest. "Martha, father," she whispered, using her baptismal name. "But my mother calls me Maddie." Jedediah reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was cold. He felt the heat radiating from her skin, the fever of the poison. "You are burning," he said softly, entranced. "Burning with life." He turned to his deacons. "This one, she is the vessel. Prepare the chapel." Eudora Vance, watching from the gallery above, let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. She wept silently, tears of joy streaming down her face. She had done it. She had saved her daughter. She squeezed the blue bottle in her pocket, a talisman of her success. She didn't know she had just signed Maddie's death warrant. The engagement was short. 15 days. 15 days for the poison to accumulate. 15 days for the mercury to settle into the kidneys, the liver, the nervous system, while the compound prepared for the wedding, slaughtering the last of the autumn hogs and tapping the kegs of moonshine. Maddie was deteriorating. The initial rush of energy had faded, replaced by a crushing nausea. Her gums began to bleed. Her hair, once thick and lustrous, started to come out in clumps when she brushed it. She had nightmares of metal teeth chewing on her bones. She told her mother she was dying. "It's just nerves, baby," Eudora insisted, her voice tight with panic. She mixed a double dose of the tonic into a cup of hot broth. "You're just scared. It's a big responsibility. Drink this. It will calm the shaking." Maddie drank. She trusted her mother more than she trusted her own body. She drank the metal and she prayed for the pain in her stomach to stop. The wedding day, November 13th, 1935, dawned with a blizzard that buried the fences in 4 feet of snow. The compound was sealed off from the world. There was no escape, even if Maddie had wanted to run. She was dressed in a gown of white lace, an heirloom that Jedediah had kept from his first wife. It smelled of lavender and mothballs. It hung loose on her frame. She had lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks. Her skin was gray, translucent, the veins showing through like blue maps. Eudora had to apply heavy rouge to her cheeks to hide the pallor of death. "Stand up, Maddie," Eudora urged, pulling her daughter from the bed. "I can't feel my feet, Mama," Maddie whispered. Her speech was slurring. The mercury was attacking her brain now, dissolving the connections that allowed her to articulate words. "You will walk," Eudora said fiercely, holding Maddie upright by the shoulders. "You will walk down that aisle if I have to drag you. Do not shame us. Do not let him see you weak. If he rejects you now, we are dead." The ceremony took place at midnight by candlelight. The chapel was packed with 300 members of the flock. The air was thick with the smell of burning tallow, unwashed wool, and fear. Jedediah stood at the altar looking like an Old Testament prophet, waiting for his prize. Maddie walked. She moved like a marionette with cut strings. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. The congregation whispered that she was overcome with the Holy Spirit. They saw her stumbling as a sign of humility, of a soul overwhelmed by the presence of the prophet. But Jedediah saw something else. As she reached the altar, he saw the sweat drenching her veil. He saw the way her eyes rolled back in her head. He saw the tremor in her hands that shook the bouquet of dried winter flowers until the petals fell like snow. He took her hand to place the ring. Her skin was burning hot, yet dry as parchment. "Do you, Martha, pledge your body and soul to the preservation of this sanctuary?" the deacon asked. Maddie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a trickle of dark blood escaped the corner of her mouth. Her gums were dissolving. She swayed. Eudora, standing in the front row, willed her daughter to stay upright. "Just say it. Just say I do." Maddie gasped. And then she collapsed. It wasn't a graceful faint. It was a seizure. She hit the floor hard, her body convulsing, her heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the wood. The white dress began to stain red as she coughed up blood. The chapel erupted into chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, but Jedediah didn't move. He stood over his bride, watching her writhe. He didn't see a sick girl. He didn't see a medical emergency. He saw sabotage. He looked out at the sea of faces, his followers, his family, his subjects. He saw Eudora Vance frozen in horror. He saw the cook. He saw the doctor. "Poison," Jedediah whispered. The word cut through the noise like a knife. He raised his voice, a roar that shook the rafters. "Poison! Someone has poisoned the vessel. Someone has brought the devil into my house." The doors to the chapel were barred instantly by the deacons. No one was leaving. Maddie was carried not to a hospital, but to the master's chambers. She was laid on the great bed covered in bearskins. She was still alive, but barely. The mercury had done its work. Her organs were shutting down. For the next 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the compound in white silence. But inside, a different kind of storm was breaking. Jedediah sat by Maddie's bedside. He watched her die. He listened to her delirious ramblings. She didn't ask for him. She didn't ask for God. She asked for her mother. "Mama, the blue bottle. No more. It burns." Jedediah heard it. The blue bottle. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at his kingdom. He felt the familiar, cold embrace of paranoia tightening around his throat. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't natural causes. It was an assassination attempt. They were trying to kill his heir before it was even conceived. He turned to his head of security, a man named Silas who had been a strikebreaker in the coal mines before finding God. "Bring me the mother," Jedediah said, "and bring me everyone who touched the food, everyone who touched the water. Bring them to the barn." The barn father, Silas asked. "The barn," Jedediah confirmed. "We are going to thresh the wheat." Eudora Vance was sitting in her cabin, staring at the blue bottle on her table. She knew. Deep down, in the place where mothers know things they cannot admit, she knew. She had done this. She had tried to save her daughter, and she had destroyed her. When the heavy boots stomped onto her porch, she didn't run. She didn't hide the bottle. She sat there, her hand wrapped around the cold glass, waiting for the judgment that was coming. But she didn't know that her punishment wouldn't be a trial. It wouldn't be a simple execution. Jedediah Blackwood didn't want justice. He wanted a purification. And in the frozen isolation of Montana, with the law 100 miles away and the snow piled high against the gates, there was no one to stop him from turning the sanctuary of the Eternal Peak into a slaughterhouse. The barn was not built for judgment. It was built for livestock. It smelled of wet hay, old manure, and the sharp copper tang of rusted tools hanging from the rafters like instruments of torture. But on the night of November 14th, 1935, the sanctuary's barn became a courtroom where the only verdict was suffering. Outside, the blizzard had turned the world into a white void, erasing the horizon and the road back to civilization. Inside, the only light came from kerosene lanterns that swung in the draft, casting long, swaying shadows that looked like hanged men dancing on the rough timber walls. Eudora Vance sat on a milking stool in the center of the threshing floor. Her hands were not bound, but they might as well have been. Fear had paralyzed her muscles. She was surrounded by the deacons, 6 men in heavy wool coats holding axe handles and Winchesters. Their faces were hidden by scarves, but their eyes were hard, devoid of the neighborly warmth she had known for 5 years. Silas, the head of security, a man who had once helped Eudora fix her roof, stood in front of her. He held the blue glass bottle up to the lantern light. The silvery liquid inside caught the glow, swirling heavy and sluggish, beautiful and deadly. "It's medicine," Eudora whispered. Her voice was small, swallowed by the vast, vaulted ceiling of the barn. "It's just a tonic. My grandmother used it in the camps. It brings life. It heats the blood." "It brought death, woman," Silas said. His voice wasn't angry. It was flat, terrifyingly practical. He uncorked the bottle and sniffed it. "It smells of the mines. It smells of the devil's chemistry." The barn door creaked open. Jedediah Blackwood entered. He didn't stomp the snow off his boots. He let it melt on the floorboards, creating dark puddles that crept toward Eudora's feet like ink. He looked at her not with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying disappointment. To him, Eudora wasn't a mother trying to help her child. She was a saboteur. She was a vessel of the outside world's corruption, sent to destroy his paradise from the inside. "You poisoned the bloodline," Jedediah said softly, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Why?" "I wanted her to be strong," Eudora sobbed, her composure finally shattering into jagged pieces. "She was weak, Father. She was fading. I just wanted her to be strong enough to carry your burden. I did it for love, a mother's love." "Love?" Jedediah laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound, like a branch breaking in winter. "Love is obedience, Eudora. Anything else is just ego wrapped in sentiment. You tried to play God. You tried to alter the vessel I chose. And because of your arrogance, the bride is dying." He turned to the deacons. "The storm is God's way of sealing us in. He wants us to clean our own house. We cannot bury her in the frozen ground. The ground rejected her gift. So we will give her to the air." The threshing was a term the iron flock used for discipline. Usually it meant a public shaming or a few days without food to break a rebellious spirit. But tonight, the atmosphere had shifted. The collective anxiety of the cult, fueled by the howling wind and the sight of their leader's dying bride, had curdled into a mob mentality. They needed a scapegoat. They needed to believe that the tragedy was not a random act of biology, but a specific act of evil that could be purged. They dragged Eudora out of the barn. She didn't scream. She went limp, her heels dragging through the fresh snow, leaving 2 parallel furrows like ski tracks. They took her to the water tower, the highest point in the compound, a wooden structure that loomed over the cabins like a watchtower. The wind chill was 30 degrees below zero. It was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. They didn't hang her. Jedediah believed that spilling blood on the holy ground would curse the soil further. Instead, they stripped her of her heavy wool coat. They tied her to the legs of the water tower with rough hemp rope facing the wind. "Let the cold judge her," Jedediah commanded, looking at her shivering form. "If she is innocent, the Lord will keep her warm. If she is guilty, the frost will take her." It was a medieval sentence carried out in the American West. Eudora Vance, a mother who had loved her daughter too much and too stupidly, was left to the mercy of the Montana winter. Within 20 minutes, the violent shivering began to subside. Hypothermia is a cruel deceiver. It stops the pain before it kills you. Her mind, already fractured by guilt, began to drift away into the white noise of the storm. She didn't think about the cold anymore. She thought about the blue bottle. She thought about the way the silver liquid looked like moonlight. She thought she was warm. Back in the master's chambers, Maddie Vance was entering the final stage of mercury poisoning. It is a hideous way to die. The metal doesn't just kill the organs, it unravels the mind. Maddie was hallucinating. The heavy bare skins on the bed felt like they were biting her. She saw snakes made of liquid silver crawling on the ceiling. She saw her hands turning into claws. She screamed that her skin was on fire, tearing at her nightgown until her chest was scratched and bloody. Dr. Holloway, the compound's physician, stood in the corner of the room, wringing his hands until the knuckles cracked. He was a man who had lost his license in Chicago for malpractice before finding refuge in the flock. He knew exactly what was happening. He recognized the symptoms: the loosening teeth, the excessive salivation, the tremors, the erethism, the neurological madness caused by mercury toxicity. He knew that Eudora's tonic was the cause, but he also knew that telling Jedediah the truth, that this was a medical tragedy caused by ignorance, not a spiritual attack caused by demons, would not save Maddie. It would only endanger him. Science had no place here. Logic was treason. So, he lied. "It is a possession, Father," Holloway told Jedediah when the preacher returned from the execution, his coat dusted with fresh snow. The poison opened a door, and something dark walked in. "Her soul is fighting a war against a legion." Jedediah looked at his dying bride. Her beauty was gone. Her face was gray, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. He felt a surge of revulsion. He had wanted a queen. He had been given a broken doll. "Seal the room," Jedediah ordered, turning his back on her. "Let the spirit depart. I will not watch this." He walked out, leaving Maddie to die alone in the dark, surrounded by the opulence of a kingdom she never wanted, drowning in the fluid filling her own lungs. For the next 2 days, the iron flock existed in a state of suspended terror. The storm refused to break. The snow piled up against the windows, turning the cabins into tombs. No one was allowed to leave their quarters. The deacons patrolled the perimeter on snowshoes, their faces wrapped in wool scarves, looking for phantom enemies in the whiteout. Maddie died on the morning of November 16th. She died silently, her heart simply stopping under the weight of the toxin. When Holloway checked her pulse and nodded to the guard, the news spread through the compound like a virus. The bride was dead. The curse was real. God had turned his face away. But Eudora Vance didn't die as quickly. When they went to check on her the next morning, she was still tied to the tower. She was alive. Frostbite had turned her skin black, and she was catatonic, but her heart was still beating a slow, stubborn rhythm. A miracle, some whispered in awe. A sign of a witch, Jedediah declared with fury. He ordered her brought back into the barn. He wasn't finished. The paranoia had fully taken root in his mind now, choking out all reason. If the mother was the poisoner and the cold hadn't killed her, she must have had help. She must have had accomplices. Who had sold her the tonic? Who had whispered in her ear? Who else in the camp was a traitor? Jedediah convened a council of purification. He stood on the threshing floor and called out 20 names from the roster of the flock. He didn't choose them based on evidence. He chose them based on proximity. The cook who prepared the wedding feast, the seamstresses who sewed the dress, the stable boy who had carried Eudora's trunk when she arrived. Even Dr. Holloway was summoned. They were herded into the barn, shivering, terrified, still wearing their sleepwear. Eudora lay on the floor in the center, a frozen, breathing statue of misery, unable to speak, unable to defend them. "The infection spreads," Jedediah announced, pacing in front of them, his shadow looming large against the timber walls like a giant. "We cannot cut out just the heart. We must remove the limbs. The body must be pure." He held up the blue bottle again. Who else touched this? Who else knew? Silence. Only the sound of the wind rattling the barn doors. Very well, Jedediah said. He pulled a revolver from his coat. It was a heavy Colt .45, a relic of the Old West. If you will not speak to me, you will speak to God. He walked up to the stable boy, a kid named Thomas, no older than 16. Thomas had been born in the cult. He had never seen the outside world. Did you see her mix it? Jedediah asked softly. No, father, I swear, Thomas cried, falling to his knees, clutching the hem of Jedediah's coat. I only carried the wood. Jedediah cocked the hammer. The sound was deafening in the quiet barn. Lies are the tongue of the serpent. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot didn't just kill the boy. It killed the last shred of sanity in the iron flock. The violence had begun, and like an avalanche, once it started, it could not be stopped. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of hay. Over the next 12 hours, the barn became a slaughterhouse. Jedediah didn't kill them all himself. He forced the deacons to do it. He forced them to prove their loyalty in blood. It was a purge fueled by hysteria and the claustrophobia of the storm. Anyone who cried was suspect. Anyone who looked away was guilty. Dr. Holloway, realizing his time was up, tried to run for the door. Silas caught him with the blade of a shovel. They dragged him back to the center. You said it was a possession. Jedediah spat at the doctor, looking down at him. But you let her die. You're a false prophet of science. You failed the vessel. Holloway's scream was cut short. By midnight, 14 bodies lay in the barn. Eudora Vance was still alive, forced to watch it all through eyes that could no longer blink due to the frostbite damage to her eyelids. She was the anchor of their madness, the witness to the destruction she had inadvertently caused. But in the chaos of the purge, a mistake was made, a fatal oversight. One of the kitchen girls, a quiet, mousy thing named Sarah, ironically named after the previous dead wife, had been overlooked in the initial roundup. She wasn't on the list because she was invisible to Jedediah. She washed the dishes. She scrubbed the pots. She was nobody. Sarah had been hiding in the root cellar of the mess hall, listening to the gunshots echoing from the barn. Bang, bang, bang. She counted them. She knew what they meant. She knew that when the sun rose, they would come for the rest. Sarah was 17. She had grown up in the Bitterroot. She knew how to snowshoe. She knew the mountains. And she knew that staying meant death. Under the cover of the blizzard's whiteout conditions, while the deacons were distracted by the carnage in the barn, she stole a pair of snowshoes from the supply shed. She grabbed a handful of dried jerky and a kerosene lantern. She didn't go to the main gate, where the guards were smoking and watching the barn. She went to the back of the compound, where the palisade wall met the steep drop of the cliff. She climbed over the timber wall, dropping 10 feet into a snowbank. The cold hit her like a physical blow, punching the air from her lungs. But she scrambled up, strapped on the snowshoes with frozen fingers, and began to run. She wasn't running toward the road. That would be suicide. The deacons would patrol the road on the snowcat. She was running toward the river, following the frozen line of the Blackfoot down the mountain. It was 30 miles to Darby, in a blizzard. It was an impossible journey, but fear is a powerful fuel. Back in the compound, the madness was winding down into a grim, exhausted silence. The bodies were dragged out into the storm and stacked like cordwood behind the generator shed. The snow quickly covered them, turning the pile into just another white mound in the landscape. Jedediah returned to his quarters. He sat by the bed where Maddie's body still lay. He poured himself a glass of wine, his hands steady. He believed he had done God's work. He believed he had saved the flock from a conspiracy. He didn't know about Sarah. He didn't know that 20 miles down the mountain, a girl was crawling on her hands and knees across a frozen highway, flagging down a logging truck with the last of her strength. The truck driver, a man named Bill, who had spent his life hauling timber out of these mountains, saw the shape in his headlights through the swirling snow. He slammed on the brakes, skidding on the ice. He jumped out with a tire iron, thinking he had hit a deer or a wolf. What he found was a girl frozen half to death, her skin blue, her eyes wide with terror, babbling about poison, about a blue bottle, about a barn full of dead men. They're killing everyone, Sarah gasped, grabbing Bill's coat with frost-bitten fingers that felt like claws. The preacher, he's killing everyone. He shot Thomas. Bill drove her straight to the sheriff's station in Darby. Sheriff Cal Miller was a man who didn't like Jedediah Blackwood. He didn't like cults. And he didn't like people who fenced off public land. But he also knew that the iron flock was heavily armed and legally on private property. He needed probable cause. Sarah gave him more than probable cause. She gave him a massacre. He shot the boy, Sarah told the sheriff, shivering under 3 wool blankets, a cup of hot coffee shaking in her hands. He shot Thomas, then he made Silas kill the cook. They're stacking them in the snow. And Eudora is on the tower. Sheriff Miller looked at the storm raging outside his window. He looked at his deputy. "Get the rifles," Miller said, "and call the state police in Missoula. Tell them we have a hostage situation. Tell them to bring the snowcats. We're going up." It took 6 hours for the convoy to assemble, a mix of local deputies, state troopers, and angry townsfolk who had heard the rumors. They moved up the mountain in a column of headlights, cutting through the dark like a spear. Inside the compound, the silence was absolute. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of crystal-clear stars and a moon that illuminated the horror in stark relief. Jedediah stood on the porch of the great hall. He saw the lights coming up the valley. He didn't try to run. Where would he go? This was his kingdom. This was his Zion. He turned to Silas, who was wiping blood off his boots. "The Philistines are here," Jedediah said calmly. "Wake the brethren. Arm the walls. We will not be moved." The standoff that followed would become a legend in Montana law enforcement history. But before the first shot was fired, the police found something that stopped them in their tracks. Sheriff Miller, leading the advance team on snowshoes, reached the perimeter fence. He looked up. He saw the water tower. And he saw Eudora Vance. She was still tied to the legs of the tower. She was frozen solid, covered in a shroud of clear ice. But her eyes were open, staring out at the approaching lights. And in her frozen hand, someone, perhaps Silas, in a final act of twisted mockery, had placed the blue glass bottle. It glittered in the moonlight, a beautiful deadly jewel frozen in time. "My God," Miller whispered, lowering his binoculars. "They didn't just kill her. They made her an example." He raised his megaphone. His voice echoed across the frozen compound, shattering the stillness. "Jedediah Blackwood, this is the Ravalli County Sheriff. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands up." The answer was a single rifle shot from the watchtower. The bullet kicked up snow inches from Miller's boot. "No surrender," Jedediah's voice boomed from the darkness. "This is consecrated ground. You will not enter." The siege of the iron flock had begun, but the police didn't know that inside. The flock was already dead. The siege of the iron flock did not last for days, as the newspapers would later speculate. It lasted only 45 minutes, but those 45 minutes contained a lifetime of silence. After Jedediah's defiant shout from the darkness, the compound went quiet. There were no more gunshots, no screams, just the wind whistling through the slats of the water tower where Eudora Vance kept her frozen vigil. Sheriff Miller waited. He knew the psychology of besieged men. He expected them to dig in, to force the police to fight for every inch of snow. But as the minutes ticked by, the stillness began to feel wrong. It wasn't the silence of tactical discipline. It was the silence of a grave. "Breach the gate," Miller ordered, his voice cracking in the cold air. The state police snowcat roared to life. Its treads churned the ice as it surged forward, slamming into the heavy timber gates. Wood splintered with a sound like a cannon shot. The gates folded inward. The tactical team swarmed in, rifles raised, breath steaming. They moved past the generator shed, past the dark cabins. They found the deacons on the perimeter wall. They were dead. They hadn't been shot by police snipers. They sat slumped against the frozen logs, their own rifles in their laps, their eyes staring blankly at the moon. "Suicide," a deputy whispered, checking a pulse. "Cyanide. I can smell the almonds." Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. If the guards were dead, what had happened to the rest? To the women? To the children? He looked toward the chapel. It was the only building with lights on. A warm yellow glow spilled from the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the blood-soaked snow outside. It looked inviting. It looked peaceful. "The chapel!" Miller shouted. "Move! Move!" They ran toward the double doors. They were barred from the inside. Miller didn't wait for the ram. He kicked the latch, throwing his shoulder against the wood. The door gave way. The smell hit them first. Not the metallic tang of mercury this time, but the cloying, sweet scent of bitter almonds mixed with incense and the earthy smell of unwashed bodies. Miller stepped inside. He lowered his rifle. The deputy behind him fell to his knees and vomited. The pews were full. 50 people, the remaining faithful of the iron flock, sat in rows, as if waiting for a sermon. They were dressed in their Sunday best, the women in wool shawls, the men in clean shirts, the children in their nightgowns. They were all dead. In the hours between the purge of the barn and the arrival of the police, Jedediah Blackwood had made his final decision. If he couldn't have his kingdom, no one would. He had gathered his flock. He had told them that the Philistines were coming to take them to camps, to separate mothers from children, to force them into sin. He offered them a final sacrament. He didn't have enough mercury to kill them all quickly, so he had used the cyanide stored in the mining shed, the chemical used to leach gold from rock. It had been a quiet, orderly apocalypse. Mothers had fed the liquid to their infants with spoons, telling them it was warm milk. Husbands had held the cups for their wives. Then they had sat down, held hands, and waited for the darkness. Miller walked down the center aisle. His boots crunched on glass, broken vials scattered on the floorboards. He looked at the faces. They didn't look peaceful. Cyanide is a painful death. Their faces were twisted, their bodies contorted in the final spasms of asphyxiation. But it was the altar that drew Miller's eye, the final tableau of Jedediah's madness. Jedediah Blackwood sat in his high-backed oak chair in the center of the dais. He was wearing his ceremonial robes, embroidered with silver thread. He was dead, his head slumped forward on his chest, a silver goblet overturned at his feet. But he wasn't alone. Lying on the altar table, arranged like a sacrificial offering, was Mattie Vance. He had dragged her body from the bedroom. He had combed her hair. He had arranged her wedding dress so that it pooled around her like a white river. Even in death, her skin retained the terrifying, metallic gray hue of the mercury poisoning. She looked like a statue cast in lead, a pagan idol worshipped by a congregation of corpses. "Clear!" Miller shouted, his voice shaking. "Building is clear. No survivors." He walked up to the altar. He touched Jedediah's neck. Cold. He looked at Mattie, the mercury bride. Her eyes were open, clouded with cataracts caused by the toxin, staring up at the wooden cross hanging from the rafters. "You poor girl," Miller whispered. "You never stood a chance." He turned to leave, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on him like the roof of the world. But then he heard a sound. A scratching, a low, wet whimper. It came from the choir loft above. Miller spun around, raising his flashlight. "Show yourself!" There was a shuffling of feet. A figure crawled to the railing and peered over. It was Silas, the brutal enforcer, the man who had tied Eudora to the tower, the man who had executed Dr. Halloway with a shovel. He hadn't drunk the cyanide. He had watched them all die. He had watched the children convulse. And in the face of that absolute finality, his fanaticism had shattered. He was drooling, his eyes wide and unseeing, his hands shaking violently, the tremors of the mercury finally taking hold of him too. "The blue bottle," Silas giggled, his voice high and hysterical. "She said it would make them strong. She said it was medicine, iron and clay." Iron and clay. Miller didn't shoot him. He walked up the stairs, grabbed Silas by the collar, and dragged him down. He handcuffed him to a pew, right next to the body of the woman he had likely killed. "You're not going to heaven, Silas," Miller said grimly. "You're going to the state penitentiary." As the sun rose over the Bitterroot Mountains, the full scope of the horror became visible. The police began the grim task of body recovery. They had to bring in flatbed trucks. They had to use ice picks to chip Eudora Vance off the water tower. When they finally lowered her body, her hand was still frozen around the blue glass bottle. Rigor mortis in the ice had fused it to her skin. They couldn't pry it loose. They had to bury her with it. The investigation that followed was not a simple murder case. It was an excavation of a slow-motion disaster. The forensic analysis conducted by the State University revealed a horror far deeper than the cyanide suicide. Pathologists found that nearly every member of the iron flock had toxic levels of mercury in their systems. It wasn't just Mattie. It wasn't just the tonic. It was everywhere. It turned out that Jedediah Blackwood's obsession with purity and iron had led him to a terrifying conclusion. He believed that small doses of mercury mined from the old cinnabar claims further up the mountain would harden his followers against the diseases of the outside world. He believed he was building a master race. He had been micro-dosing the communal water supply for years. The tremors, the paranoia, the religious visions the flock experienced, they weren't spiritual. They were the symptoms of mass heavy metal poisoning, the Mad Hatter disease, playing out on a biblical scale. Eudora's tonic was just a concentrated dose of the poison they were all drinking every day. Maddie died first, simply because her mother gave her more of what the father was already feeding them. The trial of Silas was a formality. He was declared criminally insane and committed to the state hospital in Warm Springs. He died there 2 years later, screaming that spiders made of silver were eating his brain, a final horrific hallucination of the mercury that had rotted his mind. But the story didn't end with the legal proceedings. For Sarah, the girl who ran through the blizzard, the end of the cult was just the beginning of a long, quiet purgatory. Sarah was the only survivor, the final girl of the Iron Flock. She was 17, traumatized, and physically damaged by the frostbite and the trace amounts of mercury in her own blood. She had no family left. They were all in the mass grave. She was taken in by Sheriff Miller and his wife. They tried to give her a normal life. They sent her to school, but Sarah couldn't sleep with the lights off. She couldn't look at a glass bottle without shaking. She testified at the inquest, her voice small and flat. She thought she was saving her, Sarah told the jury, speaking of Eudora. That's the worst part. She loved her. She poured the poison with love. After the trial, Sarah left Montana. She couldn't breathe the air in the valley anymore. It tasted like ash to her. She moved to Seattle, found work in a cannery, and eventually married a mechanic who knew nothing about her past. She changed her name. She buried the girl who had climbed the Palisade Wall in the snow. But she kept one thing. Years later, when Sarah died of old age in 1998, her daughter found a small wooden box in the back of her closet. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a single dried flower, a winter rose from Maddie Vance's bridal bouquet, which Sarah had grabbed from the chapel floor before escaping. And next to the flower was a newspaper clipping from 1935. The headline read, "The Mercury Bride, Science Reveals the Deadly Secret of the Cult." The legacy of the Iron Flock lingered in the land itself. The compound was burned to the ground by state authorities in 1936, a final attempt to cleanse the cursed soil. But fire cannot destroy mercury. It is an element. It persists. The heavy metal leached into the groundwater. For decades, the creek that ran through the Blackwood property was lifeless. No fish, no frogs, just clear, cold water that sparkled with a deadly brilliance. The locals in Darby warned their children not to play there. They called it Ghost Creek. In 2010, a team of environmental scientists from the University of Montana returned to the site. They were studying the long-term effects of mining pollution, but they found something that chilled them more than the chemical readings. They were taking soil samples near the ruins of the old water tower, the place where Eudora Vance had been frozen. As they dug, their trowels hit something glass. They unearthed a cache of blue bottles. Dozens of them, buried in a circle around the base of the tower. It wasn't a stash, it was a shrine. Someone, perhaps Silas, perhaps other members of the flock before the end, had buried the bottles there as offerings. Offerings to the cold god they worshipped. Offerings to the mother who had died for her mistake. The scientists took the bottles away in hazmat containers. The site was declared a Superfund cleanup zone. The soil was excavated and trucked away to a hazardous waste facility in Idaho. But you cannot excavate a memory. The story of Maddie Vance, the Mercury Bride, became a piece of American folklore, a ghost story told around campfires in the Bitterroot. But it is more than a story. It is a warning about the fragility of the human mind and the danger of isolation. Jedediah Blackwood wanted to build a fortress against the world. He wanted to create a race of iron men and women who could withstand the collapse of society. Instead, he built a tomb. He proved that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the cold, or the hunger, or the government. It is the belief that you alone possess the cure. The documentary ends with a modern-day shot of the valley. It is summer. The wild flowers are blooming in the meadow where the compound once stood. The mountains are green and majestic. It looks like paradise. But then the camera pans down to the creek bed. The water is clear, but there are no fish. The stones at the bottom are stained a strange, unnatural gray. They say time heals all wounds, but in the Bitterroot, the land remembers. The mercury is still there, waiting in the dark. Just like the love of a mother who didn't know that her gift was a weapon. And in the silence of the snow, if you listen closely, you can still hear the wind whispering the name of the girl who was forged in iron and broken by glass. The screen fades to black, the sound of a glass bottle rolling across a wooden floor. Then silence.